Welcome back, my friend. The lamps are lit, the wind has quieted, and somewhere in the shadows the Niffler has found something shiny again. But this time, it's not gold. It's a story, and tonight, he's ready to share it with you. So settle in and listen closely. It begins like this.
The morning of the 28th of April, 1953, was one of those spring days when the very air of London seemed to smell of possibilities. Horace Eugene Flaccus Slughorn stood before the mirror in his modest flat on Diagon Alley, adjusting his tie for the 5th time in the past hour. No, not quite right, he muttered to himself, untying the silk knot and starting over. Too pompous, must look professional but not arrogant, competent but not pushy. His reflection in the mirror, a round face without the distinguished wrinkles that would come later, russet hair neatly combed back, and a figure already beginning to acquire that comfortable roundness that would become his trademark, gazed back at him with mild reproach. Horace was 24 years old, and this was meant to be the most important day of his life. At least, that was how he imagined it. On the table by the window lay a stack of papers, his curriculum vitae, letters of recommendation from Hogwarts professors where he himself had graduated only 3 years ago, and most importantly, an invitation to meet with Deputy Minister of Magic Bartholomew Croupton. The position of head of the Department of Experimental Potions at the Ministry of Magic, prestige, power, connections with the most important wizards in Britain. Precisely what young Slughorn had dreamed of, having grown up in a family where name and reputation meant more than gold in Gringotts. "That's better," he murmured, finally satisfied with his tie. It was burgundy with thin silver stripes, elegant but not ostentatious. He donned robes of the finest fabric, his modest salary, as assistant potioneer in old Archibald Beamish's private laboratory could afford. Horace approached the window and looked down at the street below. Diagon Alley was already awakening, shop windows lighting one by one, the first visitors hurrying about their business, an owl flying past his window with a newspaper in its beak. He took a deep breath and felt butterflies stirring in his stomach. Not ordinary butterflies, of course, but magical ones, the very same that appear before important events and flutter their wings somewhere beneath one's heart. "Don't be nervous, Horace," he told himself aloud, trying to sound confident. "You were the best in your year at potions." Professor Beggett himself said he hadn't seen a better intuitive understanding of ingredients in 20 years. This is your chance. But his hand still trembled as he leafed through his papers once more, checking everything was in order. His gaze fell upon the recommendation from Professor Dumbledore, the Transfiguration teacher who for some reason had always paid him particular attention during his studies. "Mr. Slughorn possesses a rare combination of academic knowledge and practical ingenuity," the letter stated. "However, I would advise him to find such an application for his talents, where he might share his knowledge with others, rather than merely demonstrate it." A strange recommendation, when one thought about it. Horace had never understood why Dumbledore hinted at teaching. Teaching was for those who couldn't make a real career at the ministry, or in the private sector, wasn't it? Although, he had to admit, he did rather enjoy explaining complicated things to younger students in the laboratory. That moment when understanding sparked in someone's eyes, it was pleasant, but that wasn't a real career. He glanced at the clock. 9 in the morning. The meeting, at 2 in the afternoon. 5 more hours of nervous tension. Horace approached the small cabinet in the corner of the room once more, his personal collection of potions. He always kept several vials at hand, for headaches, for clarity of thought, a calming draught, a bit of veritaserum, just in case, though using it without permission was illegal. And his gaze fell upon a tiny bottle that stood at the very back, barely visible behind the other vials. Felix Felicis, liquid luck. He had brewed it 7 months ago. It had been his dissertation project, a masterpiece of sorts that had astonished even the distinguished Professor Beggett. 6 long months of brewing, constant temperature control, perfect balance of ingredients. He remembered how his hands had trembled when he added the final drop of squill essence, and how the golden liquid had played in the cauldron like liquid sunlight. Horace retrieved the bottle and turned it in his hands. The golden potion gleamed in the morning light, and it seemed as though tiny sparks of happiness floated inside. He had never used it, had been saving it. Felix Felicis was too valuable, too rare to waste on everyday matters. But today wasn't an ordinary day, was it? If not today, then when? He murmured, examining the bottle. On the other hand, wouldn't this be cheating? If he got the position thanks to a potion rather than his own merits. But Felix Felicis didn't make you cleverer or more talented. It simply helped everything fall into place in the best possible way. That wasn't deception, but rather a small nudge to fate, yes? He stood thus for a good 5 minutes, wavering. In his head raged the internal debate that anyone who had ever held Felix Felicis before an important event conducts with themselves. Finally, Horace sighed, uncorked the bottle, and carefully poured 1 drop into a small silver goblet. Just 1 drop, enough for several hours of luck. Best not to overdo it. Excess Felix Felicis could lead to reckless bravado, and that was the last thing he needed at a ministry interview. The golden drop fell to the bottom of the goblet, and Horace hesitated for a moment. Then, before he could change his mind, he quickly drank it. The sensation was marvelous, as though someone had suddenly switched on the light in a dark room, or as though a warm, pleasant confidence had blossomed inside him. No fear, no anxiety, only a calm, absolute certainty that everything would be fine. More than that everything would be wonderful. Horace smiled, feeling the tension of recent days dissolve like sugar in hot tea. He glanced in the mirror and saw himself differently. Not a nervous young wizard trying to make an impression, but a confident person who knew his own worth. Well then, he said with satisfaction. Time to be off. He took his papers, folded them neatly into a leather briefcase, a gift from his father upon graduating from Hogwarts, and was just about to apparate to the ministry when he suddenly felt an impulse. Not a thought, not a voice in his head, but precisely an impulse. A quiet, but absolutely certain feeling that he needed to go not to the ministry, at least not now. Horace stopped in the middle of the room, raising his eyebrows in surprise. What nonsense, he muttered. The meeting's at 2 in the afternoon, I need to get there. But the impulse wouldn't let go. It was gentle, yet insistent, as though someone were carefully tugging at his sleeve, suggesting a different direction. Felix Felicis at work. The potion knew something that Horace himself did not. He sighed again, this time with irritation. This was one of the problems with Felix Felicis. It gave no explanations. It didn't say go there because such and such will happen. It simply nudged, and one had to trust it, even when it seemed absurd. Very well, said Horace, feeling the potion fill him with strange confidence. I trust you. But if this makes me miss my meeting, I shall be very cross with you. He took his wand and left the flat, opening the door onto the street. Diagon Alley was already full of life. Wizards hurrying to Gringotts, witches examining the windows at Madame Malkin's robe shop, a group of students clustered at the entrance to Flourish and Blots, discussing their textbook lists. An ordinary morning in magical London. Horace stood for a moment, trying to understand where exactly Felix Felicis was pulling him. Straight along Diagon Alley? Or into a side street? Perhaps to Knockturn Alley? Though why he would need to go there he couldn't imagine. The impulse tugged his gaze leftward, toward the less popular part of the alley, where old, less frequented shops were located. Horace obediently set off in that direction, feeling rather foolish. Here he was, dressed in his best robes, briefcase under his arm, walking who knows where, instead of preparing for the most important meeting of his life. He passed the shop of antique wands, the antique shop of Mr. Boris Ollivanders, second cousin to the famous wand-maker, and suddenly stopped before a small, inconspicuous shop window. The sign above the door was barely readable with age: Victoria Twigs, rare botanical components. Horace had never noticed this shop before, though he had walked this street hundreds of times. The window was covered in dust, and through it one could barely make out rows of glass jars with dried roots and leaves. Not the most appealing sight, but something, that same impulse, told him to go inside. He pushed the door, and an old bell jingled. Inside it was dim and cozy, smelling of earth, dried herbs, and something bittersweet that he couldn't identify. The ceilings were low, the beams dark with age, and the walls covered with shelves, laden with hundreds if not thousands of bottles, jars and boxes. "One moment," came a hoarse female voice from somewhere deep within the shop. "Coming!" Horace looked around, examining the labels on the nearest jars. Mandrake root, gathered at full moon. Screaming vine seeds. Vanishing rose petals. Some names he didn't even recognize, and he considered himself fairly knowledgeable about botanical ingredients. Yes, how may I help you?" An elderly witch with grey hair gathered in an untidy bun emerged from the darkness, wearing a stained apron and holding secateurs. Her face was wrinkled like an old apple, but her eyes were lively and penetrating. "Oh, a student," she remarked, noting his youth. "Or rather, a graduate already. Young people don't often drop by. Usually only old bores like myself who know the value of proper ingredients." "Good morning," said Horace, suddenly not knowing what exactly he was doing there. Felix Felicis had brought him here, but why? Actually, want something special, eh?" Victoria Twiggs interrupted, studying his face carefully. "I can see it. You have that look, like those who seek something more than what's sold at Flourish and Blott's, or at that pompous magical ingredients emporium on the main alley. What's it called?" "Scribbins Super Components." Horace smiled involuntarily. Scribbins' Super Components was indeed rather pompous. "I'm a potioneer," he said, feeling the words flow from his mouth as though Felix Felicis were prompting what to say. "Graduated from Hogwarts 3 years ago. Best results in potions in 20 years. Currently working as an assistant, but today I have," he faltered, suddenly feeling he didn't want to boast about the ministry meeting. "I have an important day." I see. Twiggs nodded, and something like understanding flashed in her eyes. "Dressed in your finest, briefcase under your arm, and that faint scent." She sniffed. "Felix Felicis, if I'm not mistaken." Horace stepped back in surprise. You can smell it?" "Child, I've been working with plants and ingredients for 60 years. Twiggs smiled. "I can recognize Felix Felicis from a mile away. It has such a particular, how shall I say, aura. So you truly have an important day, if you didn't spare rare potion." "A meeting at the ministry," Horace admitted, not knowing why he was suddenly telling this unknown witch. "Position as head of the Department of Experimental Potions." "Ah." Twiggs drew out, and something in her tone suggested she wasn't terribly impressed. "The ministry? Well then, good stable work. Boring, of course, but stable." Horace opened his mouth to object, but Twiggs had already turned her back and walked deeper into the shop. "Come here, lad. If Felix Felicis brought you to my doorstep, there's a reason for it. Let me show you something interesting." And Horace, guided by the potion and curiosity, followed her into the depths of the shop, not knowing that the next few hours would overturn all his ideas about what he truly wanted from life. Victoria Twiggs led Horace through a labyrinth of shelves that seemed taller and denser than one could have expected from looking at the shop from outside. Horace suspected extension charms had been used, and rather powerful ones, judging by how far they were walking. The air grew thicker with scents. Here it smelled of damp earth and something sharp and spicy. There, sweet and almost intoxicating, and a few steps further, cold and metallic. "Here, look at this," said Twiggs, stopping by a small workbench cluttered with potted plants. But these were no ordinary plants. One had leaves that shimmered with all the colors of the rainbow. Another trembled as though from cold, though the room was warm, and the third seemed to be watching them with tiny green eyes on its stalk. "This is Mimosa magicus," Twiggs explained, pointing to the plant with eyes. "Rare, temperamental, and most potioneers don't even know of its existence, and those who do usually don't understand how to work with it." "I've never heard of such a thing," Horace admitted, leaning closer. The plant watched him with interest, then suddenly its little leaf stretched out and gently touched his finger. "It senses emotions," Twiggs continued. "And not just senses, it can amplify or diminish them, depending on how you ask. Imagine one tiny drop of juice from its leaf in a calming draught, and it becomes 10 times more effective. But try to tear off a leaf roughly, without respect, and it will release such a cloud of spores that you won't be able to feel anything but melancholy for a week." Horace listened, enchanted. He truly had never heard of Mimosa magicus, and he considered himself fairly educated in botanical components. "And how How did you make it grow? He asked, carefully examining the pot. It must be incredibly capricious. Twigs smiled, and in her eyes appeared a spark that Horace knew well, the spark of a true master who had finally found someone who could appreciate their work. Here, lad, lies the secret that most potioneers don't know. She leaned closer, as though about to reveal a great mystery. It's not about what you use, it's about how you treat it. Plants are living beings. They sense when they're treated as mere ingredients, and when they're respected. And if you can establish a connection with them... She fell silent, and Horace felt something click in his head. This wasn't new information. Technically, he knew that some plants reacted to emotions, but no one had ever explained it so simply and yet so profoundly. You mean empathy? He said slowly. Towards ingredients? Precisely. Twigs clapped her hands in satisfaction. Most potioneers are so technical. Measure this, add that, stir clockwise 7 times. But the best potions, the most powerful ones, they're created by those who understand that ingredients have souls. One must feel them, speak with them. Horace wanted to stay and listen more. This was fascinating, a completely different approach to potion making than what he'd been taught at Hogwarts, but suddenly he felt a new impulse. Felix Felicis gently but insistently pushed him onwards. Time to go. This is incredibly interesting, he said, meaning it sincerely. But I must go. The meeting. Twigs waved her hand. Of course. The ministry doesn't wait. But take this. She plucked a small leaf from the Mimosa magicus. The plant calmly allowed her to do so, and handed it to Horace. As a keepsake. And remember, the best potioneers are those who love their work and respect their ingredients. Technical knowledge is wonderful, but without heart, even the most perfect potion will be empty. Horace carefully took the leaf and tucked it into the pocket of his robes. He thanked Twigs and left the shop, feeling he had just learned something important, though he couldn't yet fully understand what. On Diagon Alley he glanced at the clock on the Gringotts Tower. 10 o'clock in the morning. He still had plenty of time before the meeting. Too much if he was honest. Perhaps he should go home, review his papers once more, calm himself. But Felix Felicis nudged him in a different direction again. This time, towards a small side street that branched off from Diagon Alley and led to lesser-known shops. Horace sighed. Very well, he muttered. But if I'm late... He went where the potion led him, and soon found himself before a shop that looked as though it hadn't been opened in 20 years. The sign above the door was almost illegible, but Horace made out, Arsenius Jigger's Antiquities, buy and sell. The door was ajar, half open, as if inviting entry. Horace pushed it and found himself in a room ruled by chaos. Everywhere lay piles of old things, broken wands, worn robes, stacks of yellowed books, dented cauldrons, ancient magical devices whose purpose Horace couldn't even guess. Is anyone here? He called out loudly. From a pile of old robes in the corner suddenly emerged a head. An elderly wizard with a grey beard, spectacles on the tip of his nose, looking like someone who had just woken up. Eh? What? A customer? He looked around, as though not quite understanding where he was. Oh yes, of course. Welcome to Jigger's Antiquities, the finest antique shop in... Where are we, by the way? On Diagon Alley, Horace answered carefully. The wizard seemed rather eccentric. Ah, yes, of course, nodded Arsenius Jigger, finally fully extricating himself from the robes. Forgive me, lad, dozed off a bit. So what interests you? We have excellent antique cauldrons, collectible wands, not for use of course, but beautiful. There's even an authentic goblin-made sword, rather rusty admittedly, but goblin-made. Horace looked around, not understanding why Felix Felicis had brought him here. He wasn't a collector of antiquities, but suddenly his gaze fell upon a small book lying atop a pile of others. The cover was worn brown leather, without a title. Something about it caught his attention. This book, he said, pointing to it. May I look? What? Oh, that old thing. Jigger picked up the book and blew the dust off it. Found it at an estate sale. Some collection of notes, it seems. Nothing special, but take it if you like. 5 sickles. Horace took the book and opened it. It was a diary. The notes of some potioneer dated to the beginning of the century. The handwriting was old-fashioned but legible, and Horace saw diagrams, recipes, observations, and suddenly one phrase caught his eye. Today, I understood something important. The best potions emerge not when you most precisely follow the recipe, but when you listen to the cauldron. Each brewing is a conversation. Horace felt something tighten in his chest. This echoed what Twiggs had just said. Empathy, connection, conversation with ingredients. "I'll take it," he said, retrieving his purse. Jigger raised his eyebrows in surprise. "Really? Well, your choice. 5 sickles, please." Horace paid and left the shop, clutching the diary under his arm alongside the briefcase. He glanced at the clock. 11 o'clock. Time was flying strangely fast, but he could still make it. Perhaps he should finally head to the ministry. Arrive early, settle in a bit. Felix Felicis categorically disagreed. A new impulse pulled him. Upward. Horace raised his head and saw a sign. Stairs to the upper quarter, private laboratories. The upper quarter. He had heard of this place. There were located the private laboratories of the most talented potioneers, alchemists, and magical researchers in London. Getting there without an invitation was practically impossible. It was a closed club of the magical elite. "You're joking," muttered Horace, looking at the stairs. "They won't let me in." But Felix Felicis knew better. Horace sighed and began climbing the stairs. They wound upward like a serpent, and the higher he climbed, the quieter became the sounds of Diagon Alley below. Finally he found himself before massive oak doors with a brass plaque. "Upper quarter, members only." By the doors stood a wizard in formal robes, evidently a guard. He glanced at Horace with doubt. "Pass?" he asked curtly. "I have." Horace began, but suddenly the doors opened, and out stepped an elegant middle-aged witch in expensive velvet robes. "Oh!" she exclaimed, nearly colliding with Horace. "Forgive me, I didn't see." She raised her gaze, and her eyes widened. "Horace Slughorn?" Horace blinked in surprise. Did he know this witch? The face seemed vaguely familiar, but— "Lady Cassandra Wainwright," she suddenly exclaimed, extending her hand. "We met at Professor Beggett's reception 3 years ago. You had just graduated from Hogwarts, and the professor wouldn't stop praising your dissertation project." Oh yes. Horace suddenly remembered. That tedious reception where he had tried to make connections with influential people, and this woman who turned out to be a famous alchemist, developer of new types of magical salves. "Lady Wainwright," he responded, shaking her hand. "Of course I remember. Your lecture on the regenerative properties of Dittany essence was fascinating." This was true. The lecture really had been interesting, though Horace had only understood half of it at the time. "You're such a charmer," Wainwright smiled. "And what are you doing here? Have you finally joined the upper quarter?" Actually," Horace began, but Felix Felicis prompted what to say. "I was just heading here. Thought I'd familiarize myself with the place." "Splendid idea," Wainwright exclaimed. "Erkin," she addressed the guard. "This young wizard is with me. Mr. Slughorn is an outstanding potioneer and my personal guest." The guard nodded and stepped aside, opening the doors. Horace barely had time to thank her before Wainwright was already pulling him inside, chattering about new projects and research. He found himself in a spacious hall with high ceilings, decorated with portraits of famous potioneers of the past. From here corridors led to various laboratories. "You simply must see Mortimer Glingby's laboratory," Wainwright was saying. "He's currently working on a revolutionary approach to stabilizing volatile potions. Absolutely brilliant. And if you're lucky, you might meet Felicity Vergelli herself. She sometimes comes here when experimenting with astral components." Horace listened with half an ear, trying to comprehend what was actually happening. He was in the upper quarter, in a place he had dreamed of entering but had always considered impossible for someone of his age and status. And Felix Felicis had simply opened the doors for him. Literally, Wainwright led him down the corridor, showing various laboratories. In one, some wizard in protective goggles was trying to tame a cauldron from which purple smoke was escaping. In another, a group of witches bent over a complex magical diagram, discussing something in a language incomprehensible to Horace and full of terms. "And here's my laboratory," said Wainwright, opening a door. "Come in. I'll show you my new project." Her laboratory was spacious, bright, filled with the most modern equipment. Horace felt a pang of envy to dream of such a place to work. "Look." Wainwright led him to a work table where stood a small silver cauldron. "I'm developing a salve that can accelerate the healing of magical burns tenfold. But the problem is that the base component, salamander essence, is too unstable at high temperatures." Horace leaned in, examining the cauldron. And suddenly, not knowing from where, a thought came to him. "Have you tried adding the essence not during boiling but after, when the temperature has already dropped slightly?" he asked. "If you stabilize the base first with powdered dragon bone, and then introduce the essence." Wainwright stared at him. I hadn't thought of that," she said slowly. "But that should work. Horace, you're a genius." He blushed slightly. "A genius?" He had simply said the first thing that came to mind, though perhaps it was Felix Felicis prompting the right ideas. They spent another half hour discussing possibilities for improving the salve, and Horace unexpectedly found himself truly understanding it. His academic knowledge from Hogwarts, his experience working with Beamish, and this new perspective that Twigs had given him, everything merged together, and he saw solutions he wouldn't have noticed before. "You know what?" Wainwright said when they had finished. "You really should consider joining the upper quarter. I can recommend you. With your talent." "It's too great an honor," Horace replied, genuinely impressed. "But I have a meeting today, at the ministry, about a position." "The ministry?" Wainwright grimaced, as though she'd been given something unpleasant to smell. "Oh, Horace, no, not the ministry. Trust my advice. Your talent would perish there. Bureaucracy, politics, endless reports. I worked there myself for 10 years, and nearly went mad. True potioneers belong in laboratories, not offices." Horace fell silent. This was the second time this morning someone had told him the ministry wasn't the best choice. He glanced at the clock on the laboratory wall. Noon. He still had 2 hours before the meeting, but Felix Felicis nudged him noticeably again. Time to go. Somewhere. Just not to the ministry. "I must go," he said, suddenly feeling tired. "Thank you for everything, Lady Wainwright. This has been inspiring." "Any time, dear boy," she smiled. "And think about my proposal. Don't rush into the ministry." Horace left the upper quarter in a strange state. He felt simultaneously elated and confused. This morning everything had seemed so simple. The ministry meeting, the position, the career. And now his head was spinning with thoughts about empathy for ingredients, about conversations with cauldrons, about the true calling of a potioneer. Felix Felicis nudged him again, this time toward a small cafe on the corner of Diagon Alley. The Golden Cauldron, a cozy place where students and young wizards usually gathered. Horace went inside, ordered coffee with cream, and found a free table by the window. He took out the diary he'd bought from Jigger and began to read. The entries were captivating. The unknown potioneer described his experiments, failures, triumphs. And in each entry one could feel love for the craft, an understanding that potion making wasn't merely science, but art. "Today I taught a young apprentice and suddenly understood. The greatest pleasure isn't in creating the perfect potion oneself, but in seeing someone else do it thanks to your advice." Understanding sparked in his eyes, and I felt that this was true success. Horace slowly set down the diary and took a sip of coffee. Something was stirring in his chest. Something uncomfortable, but important. He thought about Twigs and her words about empathy. About Wainwright, and her warning regarding the ministry. About this diary and the joy of teaching others. And suddenly, as though someone had switched on the light in a dark room, he understood. Felix Felicis had been leading him all this time not to the ministry. It had been leading him to understanding. The position at the ministry was what others expected of him. His parents. Society. His own ambitions, based on what he thought he ought to want. But what Horace actually wanted. He glanced at the clock. 1 o'clock in the afternoon. In an hour. His meeting. He could go, could get that position, With his talent and Felix Felicis still working, he would almost certainly get it, but did he want it? Horace sat at the table, staring out the window at bustling Diagon Alley, and for the first time in many years didn't know what to do next. Felix Felicis wasn't prompting, as though waiting for Horace to make the decision himself. And precisely at this moment, the cafe door burst open, and in rushed a breathless wizard in a stained apron. "Help!" he cried. "Is there a potioneer? Anyone? I've had a cauldron of Amortentia explode in my storeroom, and now all the mice are in love with the cat, and the cat's trying to eat my shoes. Help!" The cafe patrons looked at one another, clearly not intending to get involved in this absurdity. And Horace suddenly laughed. For the first time this strange day, simply and sincerely laughed, and stood up from the table. "I'm a potioneer," he said. "Show me where this trouble is." The storeroom proved to be a true chaos. The breathless wizard, who introduced himself as Reginald Pickering, proprietor of a small shop selling zoological supplies, led Horace through the back doors to a large room filled with cages, boxes, and sacks of feed. And everywhere, absolutely everywhere, reigned absurd mayhem. 3 mice sat by an enormous ginger cat, gazing at him with expressions of sincere adoration. The cat, for his part, looked simultaneously embarrassed and irritated, and held Mr. Pickering's boot in his teeth. Several more mice had formed something resembling a choir and were squeaking in unison. It seemed they were serenading the cat. In the corner stood a cauldron from which still issued pink smoke with the scent of roses and vanilla. "I just wanted to brew some Amortentia for the shop," Pickering explained, wringing his hands nervously. "For the Valentine's Day campaign. You know, romantic gifts for magical couples." But something went wrong. The cauldron exploded, and now you have a magical romantic catastrophe. Horace finished, trying not to laugh. The mice really were singing. He made out the melody of Moonlight Serenade. "Right. First, we need to neutralize the remnants of Amortentia in the air. Second, create an antidote for those who've already inhaled it. And third, rescue your cat from excessive attention." He looked around, searching for suitable ingredients. On the shelves stood jars of feed, bottles of vitamins for magical creatures, sacks of soil for terrariums. "Do you have a working laboratory?" asked Horace. "Yes, there, through those doors." Pickering pointed to a door in the corner. "But there's also a bit, affected." Horace went into the small laboratory, where indeed everything was covered with a thin layer of pink powder, the remains of the explosion. But the cauldron was intact, and basic ingredients were available. He rolled up the sleeves of his robes, already forgetting this was his best robe for the meeting, approached the cauldron, and began to work. And here something strange happened. Horace had always been a good potioneer, technically competent, precise, attentive to detail. But now, under the influence of Felix Felicis, and everything he had learned this morning, he worked differently. He didn't simply add ingredients according to the recipe. He felt them, listened to how the cauldron bubbled, heard when it was necessary to stir faster or slower. Twigs had been right. Plants, ingredients, they truly had something akin to a soul. And when you treated them with respect, when you tried to understand rather than simply use them, they responded. He added crushed valerian root for calming, essence of cold water from a mountain stream to cool ardor, and a pinch of dust from butterfly wings for lightness and release from overly strong emotions. The antidote in the cauldron took on a pale blue color and began to burble like a spring brook. It's beautiful," Pickering whispered, looking over Horace's shoulder. "I've never seen anyone brew so playfully." Playfully? Horace considered this. Yes, perhaps. He truly felt something like a light game, a dance with ingredients, a dialogue with the cauldron. This was completely different from the rigid adherence to instructions he'd been taught at Hogwarts. 20 minutes later, the antidote was ready. Horace poured it into small vials and returned to the storeroom. Carefully he gave a drop to each mouse. They protested at first, unwilling to turn away from their adored cat, but then obediently drank. And even to the cat, who snorted, but swallowed. The effect was instantaneous. The mice shook themselves, looked around in bewilderment, as though waking from a dream, and scurried about the storeroom occupied with ordinary mouse affairs. The cat finally released the boot, licked his paw with dignity, and went to his corner as though nothing had happened. "You've saved me," exclaimed Pickering, seizing Horace's hands. "Imagine if customers had come in and seen this. I'd have been driven out of business. How can I repay you?" "Oh, it's nothing," Horace began, but suddenly felt Felix Felicis nudge him again, gently but distinctly. "Although, if you have any rare ingredients, perhaps you could—" "Yes, yes, of course." Pickering pulled him to the back part of the storeroom. "I have a private collection, ingredients I've been gathering for years, some very rare." "Take whatever you like." He opened a massive cabinet, and Horace's eyes widened. Inside were bottles with labels that would make any potioneer's mouth water. Silver dragon scale, phoenix tear, authentic, mermaid hair from northern seas. But Felix Felicis pulled Horace's gaze not to these luxurious ingredients, but to a small inconspicuous box on the bottom shelf. He crouched and took it. On the lid in old handwriting was written, "Philosopher's stone ash, handle with care." This. Horace could barely breathe. "This can't be genuine." Pickering came closer and peered in. "Ah, that. Bought it years ago at an auction." The seller swore it was the remains of the first philosopher's stone created by Nicholas Flamel. "But you know, loads of people claim to have genuine stone remnants. I never believed it. Keep it just as a curiosity." But Horace felt Felix Felicis was positively vibrating inside him, that this was something important. He carefully opened the box. Inside was fine reddish dust that barely glimmered in the light. And suddenly, like a flash of insight, Horace understood. Not through thought, not through logic, but with deep intuitive knowledge that sometimes comes to true masters. The philosopher's stone ash, if this truly was it, wasn't an ingredient in the ordinary sense. One couldn't simply add it to a cauldron and expect magical results. Its power lay elsewhere. It was a catalyst, a bridge between the potioneer's intent and the result. If one added it to a potion at the right moment, focusing on one's true desire, on the deep essence of what one wished to achieve. "I'll take this," said Horace, not knowing why he was so certain. "If you'll allow it." Take it, take it." Pickering waved his hand. "After what you've done for me, it's the least I can give." Horace carefully tucked the box into the pocket of his robes, next to the Mimosa magicus leaf from twigs. A strange collection of treasures for someone meant to be going to a ministry interview. The ministry. He suddenly remembered. Horace stepped out onto the street and glanced at the clock on the Gringotts Tower. 3 o'clock in the afternoon. His meeting had been at 2. He was late. Had missed the meeting, the most important meeting of his life. The feeling was strange, as though someone had punched him in the stomach, but at the same time he felt odd relief. The panic he'd expected didn't come. Instead, there was an empty space. A space where there ought to be disappointment, anger at himself, fear for the future. Felix Felicis was still working. Horace felt its warm, calming influence. But the potion couldn't change facts. He had missed the meeting. The position at the ministry had probably gone to someone else. All his career dreams, all his plans. He sank heavily onto a bench by the fountain, in the middle of Diagon Alley. Around him wizards and witches bustled about their business, no one paying attention to the young wizard who had just ruined his future through his own irresponsibility. Had it been irresponsibility? Horace took from his pocket the small bottle that had held Felix Felicis, now empty, and turned it in his fingers. He had trusted the potion. It had promised luck, promised that everything would fall into place in the best possible way. And he had obeyed every impulse, every nudge. And what had he received? A missed meeting, a ruined opportunity, an uncertain future. But also, a conversation with twigs about empathy for ingredients. A diary from an unknown potioneer about the joy of teaching. A visit to the upper quarter, and Wainwright's warning about the ministry's dullness. The experience of brewing the antidote when he'd felt the potion in a new way. And this strange ash that seemed to pulse with possibilities in his pocket. Was this luck? "You look as though you've just realized something unpleasant," came a soft voice from beside him. Horace started and looked up. Nearby stood an elderly wizard in simple but quality grey robes. His face was intelligent and kind, with countless wrinkles around his eyes. Wrinkles from smiles, not worries. In his hands he held a book and looked as though he'd just emerged from flourish and blots. "Forgive me, I didn't mean to intrude," said Horace, beginning to rise. On the contrary, do sit down, lad. The wizard sat on the bench beside him. Sometimes a conversation with a stranger helps to order one's thoughts. I'm Amirius Wiltshire, former professor of magical theory at Hogwarts. And you? Horace Slughorn, Horace answered automatically. Former Hogwarts student. And now I don't know who I am. Wiltshire smiled. Identity crisis? At your age, that's perfectly normal. What happened? And Horace, not knowing why, told him. About the ministry meeting, about Felix Felicis, about the whole strange day, about all the encounters and discoveries. About how he had missed the meeting, and now didn't know whether this was the greatest success or the greatest mistake of his life. Wiltshire listened attentively, nodding from time to time. When Horace finished, the professor was silent for several minutes, gazing at the fountain. You know, Horace, he finally said, Felix Felicis is a cunning potion. Most people think it gives you luck in what you want. But actually it gives you luck in what you truly need, and those aren't always the same thing. Horace nodded slowly. These words resonated with something deep inside. You said you wanted the ministry position, Wiltshire continued, but did you truly want it? Or did others want it from you, parents, society, your notion of success? Horace fell silent. He didn't know the answer, or rather he knew but was afraid to admit it. Felix Felicis showed you a different path, said Wiltshire. It showed you a world where potion making isn't a means to achieve prestige, but an art and a calling. Where teaching others brings joy. Where empathy is more important than technique. But I lost my chance, Horace whispered. That position. You lost one chance, Wiltshire corrected him. But it seems you found something more important. You found understanding of who you truly wish to be. They sat in silence. Horace felt something shifting inside him. Large, important parts of his personality seeking new places. What should I do? He finally asked. Wiltshire smiled. That's not for me to decide, lad. But if you want my advice, don't regret what happened. Sometimes we make the best decisions when we're not trying to control everything. Trust yourself. Trust what you felt today. He rose, placed his hand on Horace's shoulder. A friendly, encouraging touch. Hogwarts is always looking for good teachers, by the way, he added as if in passing. Especially those who love their subject and know how to share that love with others. Think about it. And he left, leaving Horace alone with his thoughts. Horace sat on the bench, gazing at the spring sky above Diagon Alley. The effect of Felix Felicis was beginning to fade. He felt that warm confidence slowly dissolving, leaving him alone with reality. But reality no longer seemed so frightening. He took from his pocket the Mimosa Magicus leaf, still fresh and soft, took out the potioneer's diary, took out the box with the ash, and suddenly smiled. Perhaps he had lost the ministry position, but he had found something more important. Understanding that a potioneer's true power lay not in prestige or authority, but in connection with magic, in respect for ingredients, in the joy of creating something truly valuable. And he had also understood a secret no one had explained to him before. The best potions emerge not when you most precisely follow instructions, but when you feel the process. When you respect each ingredient as a partner, not as a tool. When you love what you do, and do it with a sincere heart. This was the secret that made a good potioneer great. Not technique, not knowledge of recipes, but empathy, intuition, love for the craft. Horace stood from the bench and straightened his robes, no longer so immaculate after the day's adventures. He didn't know exactly what he would do next. But for the first time in many years he felt he was moving in the right direction. He took several steps toward his home, when suddenly he heard a familiar sound, the clicking of a beak. An owl descended directly before him, holding a letter in its talons. Horace took it, and the owl immediately flew away. The letter was on official Ministry of Magic letterhead. With trembling hands, Horace opened it. Dear Mr. Slughorn, we regret to inform you that due to your absence at the appointed meeting, we have been obliged to consider other candidates for the position of head of the Department of Experimental Potions. The position has been offered to another individual. However, Deputy Minister Croupton wished to convey that he values your academic achievements highly and hopes you will find worthy application for your talents in future. Respectfully, Ministry of Magic Personnel Department. Horace stood in the middle of Diagon Alley, holding the letter, and waited for pain, for regret, for disappointment, but instead he felt relief, and suddenly, quietly, almost imperceptibly, laughed. Felix Felicis knew what it was doing. Horace returned to his flat when the sun was already beginning to decline toward the horizon, painting the sky above Diagon Alley in warm shades of gold and pink. The effect of Felix Felicis had almost completely worn off. That warm, confident euphoria was gradually dissolving, leaving behind a slight fatigue and a strange sense of calm. He cast off his robes, no longer quite so immaculate as they had been this morning, with potion stains on the sleeves and a faint scent of herbs, and sank into the armchair by the window. On the table still lay his ministry papers, curriculum vitae, letters of recommendation, all those carefully prepared documents that were meant to open the doors to a prestigious career. Now they seemed somehow alien, as though they belonged to someone else. Horace took from his pocket his trophies of the day. The Mimosa magicus leaf, which had already dried somewhat but still retained a delicate aroma, the diary of the old potioneer with his wise reflections, and the small box with philosopher's stone ash, which lay warmly in his palm as though alive. These weren't things that would help build a career. These were things that would help make him a better potioneer, a better person. He opened the diary to a random page and began to read. 23rd of March. Today young Thomas finally brewed his first flawless cheering potion. He was so delighted he actually jumped, and I suddenly understood, this is what I teach for. Not for money, there's precious little of that anyway. Not for fame, what fame in a school? But for these moments, when you see understanding spark in someone's eyes, when someone overcomes their fears and doubts and creates something truly beautiful. This is magic of another kind, the magic of transmitting knowledge, the magic of inspiration. Horace slowly closed the diary. Something warm and painful at once stirred in his chest. He remembered how today he had explained to Pickering what to do with the antidote. How Lady Wainwright had listened to his advice about the salve. How even Twiggs, who undoubtedly knew 1,000 times more about plants than he did, still valued his curiosity and desire to learn. Teaching. Why had this thought previously seemed to him so inferior? Why had he considered that a real career must necessarily be the ministry, power, prestige? There came a knock at the door. Horace started, pulling himself from his thoughts, and went to open it. On the threshold stood a young wizard in official ministry robes with a folder under his arm. He looked tired and rather irritated. "Mr. Slughorn?" he asked without particular enthusiasm. "Yes, that's me," Horace answered, surprised. Clarence Wibberding, assistant to Deputy Minister Croupton. The wizard introduced himself, extending his hand for a shake. "I've been sent to personally deliver the official notification of rejection, standard procedure for high-level candidates." He said this so monotonously, as though repeating a memorized phrase he had said hundreds of times. "Oh, I've already received a letter," said Horace. "By Al." "Yes, but protocol requires personal delivery of documents." Wibberding took from the folder an official parchment with the ministry seal. "Sign here, please, to confirm receipt." Horace took the parchment and quickly signed at the bottom. Wibberding was already preparing to leave, but Horace suddenly asked, "You work as Croupton's assistant? Do you enjoy this work?" Wibberding stopped and slowly turned. On his face appeared the expression of someone who hadn't heard a sincere question about their well-being in a very long time. "Enjoy it," he laughed shortly, without humor. "I work 14 hours a day. The last 3 months I haven't had a single day off. My job consists of sorting through endless reports that no one ever reads, and attending meetings where they make decisions everyone will change in a week. Oh, and I also have to remember how the deputy minister likes his coffee. 3 spoons of sugar, a drop of cream, always in the green cup, never the blue, because blue brings bad luck. Enjoy it," he laughed again. "You wanted this position as head of department, yes?" "Wanted," Horace said slowly, "until today." "Sensible man," Wibberding nodded. "You know what someone who spent 5 years at the ministry would tell you. Run whilst you can. The ministry is a machine that grinds people down, takes their passion, their creativity, their desire to do something truly important. In return, it gives you a fine title, a decent salary, and the feeling that you're slowly dying inside. He said this without emotion, simply as a fact, and precisely for this reason it sounded so convincing. "But you're staying," Horace observed. "Because I'm a coward," Wibberding answered simply. "Because I'm 32, and I've spent so much time on this career that I'm afraid to change anything. Because my parents are proud that I work at the ministry, and I don't want to disappoint them." He looked Horace directly in the eyes. "But you're young. You have a choice. Don't make my mistakes." With these words he nodded and left, leaving Horace standing in the doorway with the official rejection document in his hands. Horace slowly closed the door and returned to the armchair. Wibberding's words echoed in his head, mixing with Wainwright's warning, with Professor Wiltshire's wisdom, with the entries in the unknown potioneer's diary. They were all saying the same thing, only in different words. True happiness isn't in prestige and power. It's in doing what you love, with people you respect, for a purpose that matters. He stood and approached the small shelf where he kept his personal potions, took one of the bottles, a calming draught he had brewed a month ago. It was technically flawless, the right color, the right consistency, the right effectiveness. But when he looked at it now, after today, he saw the difference. This potion had been created by a master's hands, but not heart. It did its job, but there was no paralim soul in it. That spark Twiggs had spoken of, that connection, that dialogue with ingredients. Horace put the bottle back and decided truly, with all his heart, without doubts or hesitation. He didn't want to work at the ministry, didn't want to spend his life behind a desk, filling out reports and playing political games, didn't want to become another Wibberding, tired, disappointed, clinging to a job only through fear of change. He wanted to brew potions, real, living, magic-filled potions. Wanted to study rare ingredients, experiment, discover new approaches, and he finally admitted this to himself. Wanted to share this with others. Wanted to see understanding spark in someone's eyes. Wanted to help young wizards overcome their difficulties and discover their talents. He wanted to teach. This realization came not as a bolt from the blue, but as a quiet, certain truth that had always been somewhere inside, simply waiting until he was ready to hear it. Horace approached the desk and took a clean sheet of parchment. He dipped his quill in ink and began to write. "Dear Professor Dumbledore, I recall the recommendation you wrote for me 3 years ago. You mentioned that you believed my true calling was to share knowledge with others. At the time I did not heed your words, considering them mere courtesy. But today I understood that you were right. I should like to inquire whether Hogwarts is considering candidates for the position of Potions Master or Assistant to Professor Beggett. I understand I have not extensive teaching experience, but I have a passion for potion making and a sincere desire to teach others. If such a possibility exists, I should be delighted to discuss this with you at your convenience. With respect and hope, Horace Slughorn." He reread the letter twice, then sealed it and summoned a post owl through the window. A small grey owl alighted on the windowsill, and Horace tied the letter to its leg. "To Hogwarts," he said. "To Professor Dumbledore, and please hurry." The owl hooted in understanding and flew into the evening sky. Horace watched it go, feeling something heavy and anxious that had pressed on his chest all day finally release. He didn't know whether Dumbledore would accept his proposal, didn't know whether he would be a good teacher. But for the first time in many years he felt he was moving in the right direction, not the one others expected of him, but the one he had chosen himself. Horace returned to the desk and opened the old potioneer's diary, began to read, make notes, plan his own experiments. He wanted to try what Twiggs had spoken of, an approach based on empathy and connection with ingredients. Wanted to investigate the Philosopher's Stone ash and its properties as a catalyst of intentions. Hours passed unnoticed. Horace immersed himself in work, in research, in plans. And for the first time in many years he felt not anxiety about the future, not fear of not meeting others, expectations, but sincere, deep joy in what he was doing. When outside the window it had grown completely dark, and Diagon Alley was illuminated by magical lanterns, there came another knock at the door. Horace opened it and saw on the threshold the same grey owl he had sent to Hogwarts. She held a reply in her beak. Horace's heart began to race. He took the letter, gave the owl a piece of biscuit, she hooted contentedly, and broke the seal. The handwriting was recognizable, elegant but rather whimsical, typical of Dumbledore. "Dear Horace, your letter touched and delighted me exceedingly. I have always believed you possessed a gift for teaching, and I am glad you have finally seen this yourself. Unfortunately, our current potions master, Archibald Beggett, has no plans to leave his position in the near future, though between ourselves, it is high time he retired, but he loves his work too much to let it go. However, I have another proposal. Next year we plan to expand the program of extracurricular activities for particularly talented students. We require someone who could conduct additional lessons in advanced potion making, supervise students, research projects, and perhaps from time to time substitute for Professor Beggett. This is not a full teaching position, but it would be an excellent beginning. You could gain experience, understand whether teaching truly is your calling, and at the same time continue your own research in the castle's laboratories. If this proposal interests you, do come to my office next Wednesday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. We shall discuss the details over a cup of tea and sherbet lemons. With best wishes and faith in your talent, Albus Dumbledore. PSI. Incidentally, never doubted that you would not appear at the ministry meeting. Felix Felicis is a cunning potion, Horace. It always knows better than we ourselves what we truly need. Horace read the letter again and again, and each time the smile on his face grew wider. Dumbledore had offered him not what he'd expected, but precisely what he needed. An opportunity to try, to make mistakes, to learn. An opportunity to combine research and teaching. An opportunity to grow into something greater. He approached the window and looked out at evening Diagon Alley. Somewhere there, in the ministry, someone else had received that position he'd dreamed of, and Horace sincerely hoped that someone would be happy there. As for him, he had found his own path, not the one his parents expected of him, not the one considered prestigious and proper, but his own, unexpected, rather frightening, but absolutely his. Horace glanced at the small, empty bottle that had held Felix Felicis, which still stood on the table. He had brewed this potion 7 months ago as his dissertation project, as proof of his mastery, and today it had given him something far more valuable. It had shown him who he truly was. "Thank you," he whispered to the bottle, feeling rather foolish but sincere. "Thank you for the best day of my life." And this was the truth, not because everything had fallen out as he had planned, but because everything had fallen out as it was meant to be. 25 years later, Professor Horace Slughorn sat in his cozy office at Hogwarts, settled into a soft armchair by the fireplace. On his lap lay an old diary, the very same one he had bought many years ago in Jigger's antique shop. The pages had yellowed even more, some cracked at the folds from frequent reading. But now this diary was not the only one. On the shelf beside it stood 12 more equally worn notebooks, his own records over the years of teaching at Hogwarts. Stories about students, recipes, discoveries, reflections on magic and life. Today was Saturday, and most students had dispersed about the castle or gone out to Hogsmeade. But in the corridor beyond the door could be heard voices, several students from his private club, an unofficial group of talented students whom he gathered for dinners and discussions of potion making. They called themselves various things: Slughorn's Chosen, the Cauldron Club, and lately the name Slug Club had somehow stuck, though Horace didn't quite understand where it had come from. He smiled, listening to their racket. Among them were future outstanding potioneers, healers, researchers. And he was proud that he had managed to sow in them a love for potion making, respect for magic, and understanding that true power lay not in prestige, but in mastery and passion for one's craft. On the table by the fireplace stood a small casket, his personal collection of most precious things. Inside lay the dried Mimosa magicus leaf, which he had preserved all these years. The box with Philosopher's Stone ash, which he had never used but which always reminded him of intuition and trust in oneself. And the empty Felix Felicis bottle, his talisman, a reminder of that day when he had drunk the luck potion and found not a ministry position but his true calling. Horace sometimes thought about what would have happened if he hadn't drunk Felix Felicis that day. If he had gone to the meeting, received the position, spent his life at the ministry, perhaps he would have been wealthier, perhaps more influential, but would he have been happy? He glanced at the portraits on the wall, photographs of his most successful students over the years. Some had become famous potioneers, some healers at St. Mungo's. Some had chosen completely different paths but always wrote to him, thanking him for teaching them not only to brew potions, but to think, to feel, to listen to their hearts. This was his true wealth, not gold, not titles, but knowledge that he had changed others' lives for the better. There came a knock at the door, and into the office peered a round-faced, snub-nosed student from Hufflepuff, Susan Bones, one of his most promising pupils this year. "Professor Slughorn," she asked timidly, "may I come in? I have a question about cheering potion." Of course, my dear." Horace waved his hand welcomingly. "Do come in, and help yourself to a sweet from the sideboard. I've just received a new batch of pineapple ones." Susan entered, and they became absorbed in discussion of the intricacies of adding essence of sunshine to the potion. Horace explained, demonstrated, encouraged when she doubted, and at some moment when understanding sparked in the girl's eyes, and she exclaimed joyfully, "Oh, I understand now." Horace felt that same warm joy he had felt 1,000 times over all these years. This was what he taught for, what he lived for. And when Susan left, satisfied and inspired, Horace again glanced at the empty Felix Felicis bottle and smiled quietly. "Thank you," he whispered, as he did sometimes when alone. "Thank you for that day. For the best day of my life." Outside the window the sun was setting beyond the forbidden forest, painting the sky in gold and pink shades, the very same as on that spring day 25 years ago. And Horace Slughorn, potions master at Hogwarts, founder of the Slug Club, mentor to hundreds of students, sat in his cozy office and was absolutely unconditionally happy. Because sometimes the greatest luck is not getting what you want, but discovering what you truly need.